thanks, Vivek. So I'm sure you're speaking to a group of HR people. So before we jump in straight into the topic of competencies, it's good to step back and reflect on what's changing in the market. So last year in Schneider Electric, we did a bit of a, like you said, I'm very keen to see your research findings, did kind of a crystal ball gazing as to what is the future of sales going to be like. So, and with some external research also kind of thrown in along with that, we see some 4-5 big shifts which are happening in the space of sales, taking a 2025 into and beyond. So of course, the traditional salesperson is not the only face to the customer. And we believe that going forward, the so-called sales force which we today have will only bring about 1/3 of the overall revenue. So the third thing which you're seeing is that probably in the future, you will see remote sales becoming probably close to 60 to 70% of the overall sales force. So that becomes the largest sales force. And we believe that the largest portion of the sales revenues will come through digital. And last but not the least, definitely there's going to be a significant growth in chatbots selling to chatbots. So this completely changes the landscape of sales for future. But what I also see is that in the recent times, the pandemic has kind of accelerated some of these changes. I'll call out 2 or 3 of them. One is most of the customers have become comfortable with digital. So they expect now about 60 to 70% of the interaction through digital channels. I think today, even in a Schneider Electric kind of business where we have close to half of the business coming to B2B, customers will start demanding Amazon-like experience. So, and also a lot of self-service is being expected even by B2B customers. And last but a super important element which every sales person in future needs to be understanding clearly is customers are going to be demanding more on environment and sustainability related stories which your company can tell. So these are the shifts which are happening in the organization. All of these calls for significant change in the completely sometimes new set of competencies in the sales force. And if you are a sales leader or a CEO or an HR person, this has implication on both org design and also in terms of capabilities to be built in the organization. But if you're coming back to the traditional familiar sales force, I see 3-4 significant skill set requirement coming in. One is consultative selling, of course. There's a big shift from product and box selling to consultative selling in this kind of industry. Services is becoming a very sharpened segment of selling. So it is not an add-on anymore. So that is becoming a significant independent area as I see. As I shared with you, ability for the salesperson to understand and sell the value proposition around sustainability and environment and the products you will in, whether you are selling a financial product or an engineering product or an automobile, this becomes a big important shift which I see as capability building. Last but not the least, what we calling in Schneider and we are trying to build in Schneider is for the sales force is called digital literacy. So while salesperson understands this, but there's a sharper focus on can we strengthen the digital literacy of the overall sales force. I'll kind of pause here because we have other panelists I'm sure would want to jump in on this topic. So I hope it kind of gave us to where we see it going in future.
So firstly, of course, I resonate with everything that Pinu said. And so like he also mentioned, let's take a step back and look at what are some of the forces that are driving change in the ecosystem. So of course, I mean, the way to think about it broadly, we think in 4 buckets. One is consumers, and we will spend some time on that. So one thing in the BFSI space, certainly we notice is that consumers are researching online, but still they prefer to buy offline. So there is a section of customers who buy online, a large number of customers prefer to have an intermediary, right? So there is that feeling of trust face-to-face, that level of trust is only a face-to-face because there is it's an involved process of selling. It's not like buying a vanilla product off the shelf. So there are features of the product to understand. There's a long-term commitment or financial commitment, especially if you're buying an insurance policy. So there's a lot, much more that customers want to understand, and they obviously want to trust somebody. And here the intermediary's role becomes very important, right? Whether it's an agent or an employee or any other form of distributor. However, what it means also is customers often have more information because they're also benchmarking with competition. So it's not enough for a salesperson to just know about your product. You have to also know your product in relationship to other products, because very often customers will have the research and they can go to websites and show you comparisons. So that means it's not enough. So from a competency perspective, product knowledge, which is essential part of your arsenal, so to speak, is not enough to just know your product and product features and benefits, features, advantages, benefits, but you also have to know and contrast and compare with competition. So that's one point I want to make. Linked to that, of course, in a world, customers obviously play much more balance on trust and transparency. So that has to also come through. So from a competency perspective, if people are not going to take you at face value, unless you are seen to be competent, unless they trust you with your advice, and are you transparently explaining everything? So partly it's also product knowledge, but it's also partly how you come across in terms of your ability to win trust, which happens in every situation. But the point I'm making, there is a nuance here, is that unless you are competent in terms of your knowledge, people are not going to trust you, because ultimately they're relying on you for advice here. Of course, the other part of it is the hyper-personalization part of it, which is what we're seeing. We talked about Amazon, and of course, while in a digital world, but the point I'm saying is, at the end of the day, true customization can happen face-to-face by an intermediary in front of a customer, because the nuances of the customer, if the customer wants to pause, you also pause. You want to affirm, you affirm. So all this is a much more complex selling, I would say. So to that extent, face-to-face selling has become more complex than it was before, partly because of the knowledge arbitrage that is missing now. And the second part of it, the increasing balance on trust. That's how I like to put it. Then if you move away from consumers, millennials or employees who are joining, because from sales, certainly, we see that millennials, it's a much more democratic environment. People expect collegial relationships to that extent, command and control relationships, the way sales management used to be handled, or any kind of organizational. This is not true of sales. This is true of any function. You can't, people expect the non-hierarchy. So you have to be better at influencing. So again, it's more complex in terms of your ability to influence your teams, not just customers. To that extent, there is that big shift that is also there. The third part is, of course, tech. Tech has three options. One is digital adoption. So, BFSI has also adopted digital. A lot of banking transactions, insurance transactions, every self-service option. We proudly say, and it's in the published domain, that almost 95% of all our service transactions are self-help. So people do visit branches. But again, the only point I like to reiterate is that it's not going to be ever fully digital or fully physical. It's always going to be a hybrid. So like Amazon exists, Whole Foods will also exist, Walmart will also exist. So both will exist. So customers will have choice and preference where they want to go. But digital adoption means 2-3 things. I think one part of it means that from a sales management and a salesperson, people are getting much more adept in terms of being able to, the pandemic obviously induced it. How do you train people digitally? How do you manage teams digitally? How do you inspire and motivate teams digitally? And there are a lot of digital enablements that have been put in place to help you do your job better. Whether it could be, we have something called a document calculator, which tells you, so you don't have to memorize all the underwriting guidelines. You put in the customer's profile and it will tell you what the documents are required. The whole process of onboarding has become digital. So you can do it, you can take, the customer can scan all the documents and send it to you, or a photo, or you can do it, fill up the application form and generate the whole sales login process through a consent-based OTP process. So the point I'm making is, in a digital process, sometimes what happens earlier, people would sit across the table and fill up the form in front of the customer. Now, part of this is a convenience. So I would say it's moved to assisted selling. It can be done partly face-to-face, partly on Zoom, or fully in face-to-face, or fully on Zoom or any other platform. So people have to be adept in all mediums. So people who are not able to fundamentally be very effective in a digital medium, we'll find it struggle because customers expect both to happen. And if there is especially iterations, you might not be able to always do a physical meeting. During the pandemic, we found that was a problem. People were not reluctant to meet salespeople, so we had to migrate. And there were some people who adopted to it faster, some people didn't. Then, of course, linked to anything digital, of course, we've seen an explosion in data. So better analytics means that we can now identify outliers. So from a competency perspective, sales managers have to, and sales teams have to be, are getting more data literate. Numeracy skills become important. It's not just because now you have a wealth of data to mine so you can also do much more granular analysis, identify outliers, take corrective action, do root cause analysis, because there is an opportunity to do that, and we are also supporting them. Linked to this, I would say there is also one part of it. Fundamentally, what does tech do? Tech also, moves you from centralization to decentralization. And the advent of social media means you can definitely leverage social media to also engage with customers in a much more intimate manner, because you can study the profile of customers. So that is a whole, before you even interact. So not just knowing your name, but you may also find the client's habits and everything else. So what I'm bringing in, like earlier, if you had a notebook where you would record all this and you would have prompts, now everything can be, you can remember marriage anniversaries and birthdays and habits or whatever, vacations that the person enjoys, or from the Facebook profile you can. So in a sense, there is much more information which you can leverage to create intimacy and connect. That much is there. So all of this tech is facilitating, so that to use all this effectively, to do a sales call and do it well is one shift in competency, I would say. And lastly, I'll come because it concerns particularly the financial services sector, because it's the regulation. So regulations, of course, mean that regulations are definitely support the shift towards digital, and that has definitely facilitated. But obviously, regulations mean that there is a much more bigger oversight in our context, particularly on customer complaints, customer grievances, and there is a lot of adherence to process compliance that teams need to do, much more vigilance, I would say, and ability to also do it real time. So that is also a competency, because you have to be, every person who works in the financial services sector, compliance is a very important dimension of the entire sales process, and that is something everybody had to strictly adhere to in the interest of the customer. So broadly, in these 4 buckets, consumers, employees or millennial employees, tech and regulation, these are the 4 changes, and these are the sort of competencies that one will need to develop on and and work on. And that's a work in progress. I won't say we're all there, but it's important to, I would like to end by saying that we have to be adept at both living in the physical and the digital space and in the hybrid space altogether. So it's definitely that much more complex and that's much more evolved than it was in the past. And digital, the social, the pandemic has accelerated that. It's not that it would have happened. It probably would have taken 5 years more or 10 years more to happen, but it's just accelerated the shift.
Very interesting, although both are very different businesses, fundamentally the same things also impacted here. I think, cement is very brick and mortar.
Correct.
Literally, as you may say, goes into, largely seen as a B2B rather than a B2C product. I think it's moving away. No longer cement is seen as a cement as a product and product out. It's seen as a building solution, in various, something what Binu said sometime back, it's not the product, it's not the box, but it's a solution or a concept that goes in. And that's how, I think it's going stronger and stronger, and digitization has changed quite a lot of it. So 2 fundamental things to add on to what both Binu and Jeet just said. Selling, fundamentally, one of the big differences that is going to happen is consumer is more and more informed. Consumer, before they go to buy, have already gone into and understood, done their comparisons, done their homework, and that's when they come to buy. So what then really selling means? Unlike what selling in the past was to give them all those information and help them make a decision. Today, they would have kind of made a decision, so how do we make that last closing call? I think that is the part where selling now needs to focus. right? Everything of the service-related part can actually be taken over by digitization. That last element of relationship cannot be substituted digitally, and that is becoming the primary role of a salesperson. And how do we create that relationship? How do we create, as Jeet put it, how do we create that trust? I think that is the stronger element that is coming in for salespeople. Now, one of the big changes is to how do we build that orientation in the whole sales force, because it's a shift and it's a dramatic shift. It was moving at a certain pace. Pandemic brought it all of a sudden into a certain level of shift. So how do we keep pace with that? That has been a challenge. A large number of companies have also addressed it as quickly, even like we've done, of shifting a certain part to digital, and the relationship part we isolated, training the whole sales force for that. I think that's one of the big shifts that's coming in. The digital elements itself, what was digital to a large extent meant automating the way you do things, is a big shift away to say it's not about automating the way you do things, but you adapt to new way of doing things. And that is a big shift also in orienting the sales force to say that. It's also orienting your trade channels who are partners with you to adapt to that and take it over and not be dependent. So a large part of the entire sales chain has come into that change, and that change will continue.